Hello everyone, welcome to the Balliol Positive Ethics Seminar. It's the penultimate talk of term. There's another one on Tuesday of 9th week in the evening, which is going to be about wild animal suffering. So that's the date for your diary. So we're really happy to have Aubrey de Grey with us today. In the very first Positive Ethics Seminar of the year, Toby talked about some issues which could potentially be the biggest ethical issues of the next century. And one possible candidate was anti-aging research, because if you imagine everyone could live, say, 10 times as long, maybe they live lives which are 10 times as good. So that would completely transform how society is. And in addition to that, you would have things like there would be much less suffering due to deaths. You'd be able to acquire all kinds of knowledge over the course of your life, and it would utterly transform society. So it has the potential to be a big issue. Is it a good area to work on? Well, can we actually make any progress in that area? Well, Aubrey de Grey argues that we can make a lot of progress in that area, and it is at least it seems to be a very neglected area of research. So maybe if there was a lot of work done on this topic, we could really, there could really be a transformative change as a result of it. So it could be a candidate for being one of the most cost-effective kind of uses of resources in society. And that's what Aubrey is going to be talking about, and very happy to welcome him on.
Thanks very much. Yes, thanks very much, Ben, for having me along. I seem to be in Oxford quite a lot these days. I'm delighted that there's so much interest in this university in the sort of work that I and my colleagues do at the moment. And I'm also very impressed at the general concept around this lecture series. I think an approach that tries to combine ethics and economics is something that hasn't been done enough by any means. And in this particular topic, both issues certainly rear their heads very, very prominently. So I rather enjoyed putting together the remarks for this talk. The essence of what I'm going to say actually will cover more fields than that. I'm going to talk about ethics and economics a little bit. I'm also going to talk a bit about biology, because actually that's what I do. I'm a biologist. I'm Chief Science Officer of the South Foundation that was created around my work. And so I'm only really a recreational ethicist, let alone a recreational economist. But I also will touch on a number of issues that are more sociological and perhaps also more psychological, because all of these things impinge rather powerfully on the question we're talking about here of why the research that I do and that my colleagues do is so much of a backwater, as Ben just intimated. So I have used the title that Ben suggested, essentially the cost-effectiveness of aging research, but that will really only be part of what I talk about. However, I'm going to start there, because the first thing that we have to examine in determining the cost-effectiveness of any particular research avenue to try to alter the way that the world is the extent to which the way the world currently is a problem. And in order to do that, of course, one has to look at a number of factors, but perhaps foremost among those factors is the number of people who are affected by the problem. And the numbers that I'm giving here are an estimate of that. First of all, I want to explain the first line here, the fact that death from aging does not simply mean death from natural causes. And this is something that a lot of non-biologists get wrong, because people think of aging as the thing you die of if you manage to escape death from all of the things that we don't want to get, like Alzheimer's disease and cancer and cardiovascular disease and so on. And therefore, in such circumstances, you will live a nice long innings, maybe to 90 or more, and then you'll keel over in your sleep in a nice painless way. And people think that's what they want to have happen. And of course, if they think that's what they want to have happen, then they're going to be rather hard to persuade that it would be a good idea to stop it happening. So the first misconception that I need to preempt here, not necessarily accusing anyone here of having this misconception, but it does happen a lot, is that actually the diseases of old age, like Alzheimer's and so on, are part of aging. And there's a simple way to explain why that's true. Namely, that's the only way that they can be diseases of old age. If the diseases of old age were in some way independent of aging, then they wouldn't be diseases of old age. They would affect young adults to the same degree of incidence that they affect older adults, and of course that's not the case. So what we know, therefore, is that these diseases are aspects of the later stages of the process that goes on throughout life that we call aging. And that aging is initially harmless, but that there's something going on throughout life in our bodies, even though it's inert, even though it's basically silent, latent, which eventually is not latent and causes a bunch of problems. So it is biologically nonsensical to exclude the diseases of old age from the definition of who dies of aging. And therefore, we can get the numbers I've got here. So roughly 150,000, 160,000 people die worldwide each day of all causes added together. Roughly 2/3 of those people die of causes that predominantly affect older adults, people over the age of, let's say, 50 or 60. So, that makes it pretty unequivocally the world's worst problem, the world's most serious problem. In the industrialized world, of course, where most people don't die of malaria and such like, the proportion is even higher, it's around 90%. So, I don't have any difficulty at all feeling that this is the most important thing that we ought to be working on. But most of the rest of my remarks today will be to ramify that conclusion and put it in greater profile, greater contrast. So first of all, let's also deal with the fact that even dying of, quote, natural causes is not exactly fun. Yes, it's good to live a long time, but most people would agree that it's not nearly so good to live a long time in a period of ill health as it is to live a long time in a period of good health. And it's very clear that when you get into the sort of decrepitude that is illustrated on the right-hand side here, your quality of life is not as good as the quality of the life of the people on the left, even if this guy is about to have his head bitten off by a shark. So, we must remember that even dying of natural causes is something that needs to be examined. We need to examine whether this is a desirable way to die. So, this is actually the title, the top here, is the title of a talk I gave in Manchester a few months ago to John Harris's group. I think any of you who study ethics will be familiar with John Harris's name. He's a very prominent man in this area. And he said a whole bunch of things about aging over the years. He and I know each other quite well. And I'm going to go through these 5 issues over the next half hour or so, or perhaps a little longer, before getting on to other aspects that are more germane to the title of the talk. Because I think there are a lot of ways in which one could argue that there is something actually to discuss in relation to the benefits and the ethical imperative of doing something about aging. But what I want to do is essentially say, for each of these things where it says yes if, that actually the premise is not true. In other words, that none of these potential reasons, these candidate reasons for having any kind of uncertainty about defeating aging, about the desirability of defeating aging, actually stands up to scrutiny. And therefore, the whole thing really sort of becomes a non-question. And the idea that there would be an ethics of life extension more or less goes away. So, I'm going to start with this one here, about declining health. In other words, declining quality of life. QALY is an acronym that is quite prevalent in literature on this topic. It stands for Quality Adjusted Life Years. So, the idea being that being alive is better than being dead, but being alive and healthy is better than being alive and unhealthy. And therefore, the utilitarian argument for extending life is stronger if the actual life is healthy than if it's unhealthy. So, in order to address this question and to explain why it's essentially a non-question, because the dilemma is not going to arise, I'm going to talk a bit of biology. And I know that most of you are not biologists, so I'm going to keep it very simple and superficial, I guess, but I hope I'm going to be able to explain to you where we stand on all of this. So Sense Foundation, the organisation that I work for, we're a charity. We're based actually in the US, not in the UK, though we do have a subsidiary over here. And we're interested in doing something about ageing, and specifically we're interested in this. We're interested in applying regenerative medicine to ageing. So I'm going to try and explain to you what that actually means. Essentially what it means is that we try to turn back the clock, try to make people younger, biologically younger than they were before we treated them, rather than simply slow the clock down, which is what most more traditional approaches to intervention against aging tend to revolve around. But I'm going to go into a little bit more depth in that, because both of these terms, regenerative medicine and aging, are often oversimplified, and it's important that all of you should understand what they really mean. Most people think of regenerative medicine as revolving around just two fields within biomedical technology. One of them being stem cell therapies, and the other being tissue engineering. In fact, even calling those fields two fields is a little bit of an exaggeration these days, because you can't really do tissue engineering in the modern world without doing an awful lot of stem cell research and therapy. But the point is, that's not a definition. That's just an example of what regenerative medicine could mean. In fact, regenerative medicine is broader than that. This definition works quite well. It's all about restoring the structure, the molecular and cellular structure of a tissue or an organ, or indeed the whole body, to how it was before it suffered some kind of damage. And that means that the restoration can be at any level. In particular, you can think not only in terms of regenerative medicine at the whole organ level, where you create an artificial organ in the lab and then you transplant it in the same way that you would transplant an organ from a dead person. That's what tissue engineering is. And you can also think about cellular level regenerative medicine, where you inject stem cells and they repair the organ in situ. But the point is, you can go further than that. A lot of what we do in Sense Foundation, because it turns out to matter a lot for aging, is molecular regenerative medicine, which involves not even at the cellular level, but actually at the subcellular level, repairing the structure. Putting in new molecules of one sort or another to restore the structure of the inside of a cell, or indeed the material between cells, like the extracellular matrix. Restoring this structure to how it was before the damage had been incurred. The other thing I want to mention about all of this is with relation to damage. Most of you who are familiar with regenerative medicine will be aware that the application of regenerative medicine is generally with regard to acute injury, things like spinal cord damage. And of course that's a very important application. But regenerative medicine in principle is just as applicable to the gradual, chronic, accumulating damage that we see in aging. So this is why, when appropriately defined, regenerative medicine is a realistic approach to combating, or at least an approach that needs to be considered, to combating the problems of age-related ill health. Now, let's move on to aging, because aging, again, as I mentioned, can be defined in an inappropriate way. The main problem with most definitions of aging is that they don't actually help us to orient our thoughts around how we might intervene. They may be correct in some formal sense, but they don't have the utility that we need here. So that's why I like this definition. This is a mechanistic definition, and in the first place what it says is what any mechanistic definition of aging has to say, which is that essentially aging is a side effect of being alive in the first place. So in other words, metabolism eventually causes pathology. Metabolism is the word that biologists use to encompass all of the processes, all the molecular, cellular, systemic processes that go on throughout life and keep us alive as long as we are. And pathology is the word I'm going to use to encompass all of the things that go wrong with our health in old age, all of the diseases of old age, a few of which I listed earlier, and also, of course, the things that we don't necessarily denote as diseases, but that's not bad for you, like loss of muscle mass, loss of function of the immune system, things like that. So metabolism eventually causes pathology. But the other thing that I'm saying in this definition is I'm introducing an essence of how metabolism causes pathology. I'm introducing this word damage, and this is a word that I use a lot in my talks because essentially everything that we want to do to intervene in aging revolves around damage. I'm using damage in a very precise way here. I'm defining it to mean the set of intermediates between metabolism and pathology. The set of ongoing, lifelong side effects of metabolism that are created throughout life, even starting before we're born. And the other very important aspect of damage, as I'm using this term today, is that this damage accumulates. In other words, it is not simply removed as it is created, rather there just aren't processes in the body that allow that to happen, and therefore the damage progressively accumulates. Now the damage is harmless for a long time because our metabolism is set up to tolerate a certain amount of damage. But eventually the amount of damage gets to a point that our metabolism is not set up to tolerate, and that's when pathology starts to emerge. So this is a definition of aging that I like and that I want you to focus on for the rest of my remarks. One big reason why I like this definition so much is, as I mentioned, that it helps us to orient our thoughts around what we could do about aging. And this is a graphical summary of what I mean. Pretty much all medicine that we have today to intervene against aging comes under this category here, which I'm calling the geriatric approach. And the geriatric approach is all about treating the diseases of old age pretty much the same way as we treat diseases in general. In other words, identifying the symptoms, identifying a bit about the causes, and essentially attacking the disease, trying to push it back, trying to eliminate it from the body. And it's pretty easy to see from the definition of aging that I've given that that's hopeless, that it's only ever going to be slightly beneficial, because we are targeting this over here, this pathology, which is the consequence of something that's getting worse all the time, that's damage. In other words, the geriatrician's job is getting progressively harder year by year as the patient gets progressively older, and that means that the therapies that may work somewhat will just not carry on working. So the geriatric approach is better than nothing, but not much better, and it never ever will be. We've got to find something else. So what I just told you in the past moment is not original with me by any means. A lot of people realise that the geriatric approach is not the way to go. And the essence of what people have been thinking over the past few decades, or indeed more, is the gerontology approach, which says essentially prevention is better than cure. Let's try and intervene at an earlier stage of the chain of events. Let's try and in some way clean up metabolism so that it creates these various types of damage more slowly than it naturally would. If we can do that, then of course we have the desired effect. We postpone the age at which damage reaches this threshold level of abundance that metabolism can't handle, and pathology start to emerge. And that's great. But, unfortunately, the gerontology approach has also completely failed so far to deliver any kind of health benefits. So the question then is why, and that's actually quite easy to answer. I don't have a slide here, hang on. All right. The answer is simply, metabolism is incredibly complicated. Metabolism is viciously complicated. I normally have a slide here, which I somehow left out, that shows a biochemical chart, which is a highly intricate diagram of the interactions that we understand about how cells work. And you can see, just by looking at it, that trying to improve it, trying to actually make it work better, is basically a non-starter at this point. But also, what's even worse, is that biochemical chart is a simplified, of course, summary of a small subset of what we know about how metabolism works, which is completely dwarfed, as any biologist will tell you, by the amount that we don't know about how our cells work, how our bodies work. So it's even worse than it looks on the diagram. It's even worse than that. It's basically hopeless trying to do the gerontology approach with anywhere near the amount of knowledge that we have today about biology. We can't do it. So it's not an idea that's broken in principle like the geriatric approach, but it's an idea whose time has emphatically not come. And this line of thinking is what led me, perhaps 12 or so years ago, to embrace what I like to call the maintenance approach, or the engineering approach, or something like that, which says let's not actually try to slow down this process where metabolism creates damage, and let's also not try to slow down this process where damage creates pathology. Instead, let's try to uncouple those processes from each other. Let's separate them by going in and periodically repairing the damage so that it never gets to the threshold level that's bad for you. The idea here is that that would be sufficiently preemptive that it wouldn't have this sort of downward spiral problem that the geriatric approach has. But also, it intervenes here in these things that are initially inert, initially harmless, and therefore effectively we're leaving metabolism alone. We are letting metabolism get on and do what it's evolved to do, and therefore we don't have to understand metabolism really particularly. We just have to characterize this damage rather than characterizing how the damage is created, and then find ways to actually fix it. So that's pretty good. And it turns out to be better than that, because if you ask, well now let's actually get down to hardcore biology, what is damage? What are these intermediates? Then you get essentially a classification, like I've listed on the left-hand side of this table. This is a sort of 7-point classification that I came up with a decade or so ago, and that has seemed to be standing the test of time, to be honest. It seems that people are more or less agreed that this does cover the bases in terms of what we need to fix if we're going after the maintenance approach. Cell loss, now that just means cells dying and not being automatically replaced by the division of other cells. Molecular garbage, molecular byproducts of normal, essential metabolic processes that, for whatever reason, the body does not have the ability to break down or to excrete, so they accumulate. Some of them accumulate in the spaces between cells, some of them accumulate inside cells, down here number 6, and so on. You see, you get the idea. But it's even better than that. It turns out that all of these 7 categories are potentially amenable to interventions, not just interventions to slow down their accumulation, but interventions actually to fix them, and interventions that are foreseeable. Things that in some cases, the top 2 here in particular, are already very close to implementation. So some examples are in clinical trials, and in these other cases they're further away, but we have a very detailed idea about how to go about implementing them. At this point, well, I mean, a good way of just demonstrating that is to talk about my book. I wrote a book a few years ago in which each of these 7 things was the subject of an entire chapter describing not only the problem but the various approaches to the solutions. And of course you'll appreciate that the more detail one can muster with regard to actually how to solve a particular technological problem, how to go from here to there, the more likely one is to actually be right. The more likely one is to be able to have some confidence in how long it's going to take, for example. So it's pretty good news that all of these 7 things can be, 7 technologies can be described in such detail. But there's more. You will have noticed, if you were observant, that up here I talked about adding 30 years of additional life to the recipients of these therapies. And there's a couple of features about what I said there that I want to highlight. The first thing is I want to highlight a really good thing about it, which is that it's 30 years given to people who are already in middle age when we start. You don't have to be kids in order to benefit from these things. In contrast to the situation with therapies of the sort that I call the gerontology approach, which just slow down the accumulation of damage. There, of course, the earlier you start, the better. But the other thing I want to point out is it's only 30 years, and the reason is because these fixes that I'm talking about here will not be 100% effective. Each of these categories on the left-hand side of the table is a category, and in particular that means that there are many subcategories within each category, things that are somewhat different in different cell types and so on. And some of them are just going to be harder than others to fix. So we're not going to fix the entire problem just like that. My belief is that we have a good chance, let's say a 50-50 chance at least, of developing the technologies I describe on the right-hand side of this table within the next 25 years or so. But my view is that the quality of those technologies that we will have at that time will be sufficient only to fix what I'm going to call the easy damage, the damage that is relatively amenable to biomedical intervention. There will still be some difficult damage that's continuing to accumulate, and that's why we're not going to get indefinite longevity, indefinite health, and therefore the potential for indefinite longevity out of the therapies that will arrive in the next few decades, if I'm right. I'm going to talk a bit more about that whole question, though, because it turns out that there are some somewhat counterintuitive features of it that it's very important to understand in order that we can properly address the question that I came here to discuss. In other words, the cost-effectiveness of defeating aging. Here is a obviously very schematic summary of what would happen if we were able to slow aging down by a factor of 2. So aging is denoted, normal aging is denoted by the red line here, where of course you've got age on the x-axis. On the y-axis we've got reserve. Reserve is simply the reciprocal of damage, the amount of additional damage that you can afford to accumulate before something starts going wrong. So of course at age 0 you start off with not much damage, lots of reserve. Time passes, aging happens, you accumulate damage, your reserve is depleted, eventually you hit this dotted line here called the frailty threshold. That's when pathologies start and you're not long for this world after that. So the blue line denotes the situation where you start taking these age retardation therapies, which of course I did say are impractical for the foreseeable future anyway, but let's just ignore that for the moment. You start them here, you of course get a bunch of extra life. And furthermore, pretty much all the life that you get, the extra life that you get, will be healthy. It'll be above the frailty threshold. Because once pathologies start to emerge, therapies that simply address the damage probably aren't going to work much anyway. The pathologies of old age really are a sort of self-reinforcing downward spiral that has a life of its own, so to speak. And therefore, the slope of this last section of the line is pretty much the same as it's in the red line. So that's slowing aging down. But there's a problem, which I already alluded to in fact, namely that, hey, that's the chart that, I have no idea how I got to do that. Alright, that's the chart that I was originally going to show you. Alright, there's a problem, which is that you have to start early. If you only start at, let's say, age 60 instead of age, let's say, 30, then it's the yellow line here, the line that you can see now. And the benefit that you get is still mostly healthy life, but there's much less of it. You get much less healthy life because you're too close to the frailty threshold before the therapy begins. So of course you've got to start early. But unfortunately, some of us will be unlucky enough not to be this age when the therapies are developed, so that's not an option. Now there's one caveat to what I just said, which is that we might be able to carry on improving the quality of the therapy. So here, for sake of argument, I'm talking about a therapy which, again, is halving the rate of accumulation of damage, the rate of aging. But then before the beneficiary of this therapy gets to the frailty threshold, we make improvements to the therapy so that it halves it again, so that it's only a quarter as fast as in natural aging. And of course that means that the person gets a little extra benefit. But it's still not as good as if he started early. So it's all still rather miserable. Now, let's consider, by contrast, the situation with the maintenance approach, where we are periodically repairing damage. This is what we're talking about. So now I'm comparing like with like here. I'm comparing, first of all, two different therapies applied starting at the same age, let's say 60. Secondly, I'm applying two therapies that are of the same quality. So this yellow line halves the rate of accumulation of damage. The purple line halves the amount of damage by fixing the easy damage, and for the sake of argument we're going to assume that that means half the damage. Now of course the cool thing here is that we can apply it more than once. So after we apply it, this person is now rejuvenated back to here, but then we haven't slowed down the accumulation of damage, so they get an accumulation at the same slope as the red line, but then we can apply again and again. And of course we hit diminishing returns because we're not fixing the difficult damage up here, and therefore the difficult damage eventually on its own is able to push our hero over the frailty threshold. But as you can see, we get a vastly greater benefit than we would if we just slowed aging down. Very important thing to remember there. But as I have already said 4 times, it's better than that. Because if we now combine the two concepts that I've just introduced, number one, the concept of using repair rather than retardation, and number two, the concept of improving the therapies a bit more every so often, then what we get is this orange line. Here what we're saying is it's a reversal therapy, a repair therapy. But the second time our hero comes in for the rejuvenation therapy, he or she gets a better one. And in particular that means that it fixes the easy damage, same as it did before, except there's not very much easy damage because it's only been a little while, let's say 15-20 years since he or she came in the previous time. But also the new therapy fixes some proportion, let's say half, of the difficult damage. And suddenly we don't get diminishing returns anymore. Over the long term, what we see is a progressive rejuvenation, people getting biologically younger as they're getting chronologically older. And, of course, there's a rather qualitative difference here between this orange line and all the other lines. Namely, the orange line never hits the frailty threshold. So, even though in this scenario we never have a therapy that's actually perfect, to be 100% able to repair all the damage, nevertheless, the impact on health of the beneficiaries of these therapies will be identical to how it would be if the therapy had been 100% perfect from the very beginning. These guys never get to the frailty threshold. They stay biologically like young adults as long as they avoid being hit by a truck. That is the key point. So, what are we left with? The only real caveat that we're left with is the improvements here have to be fast enough. So you'll probably notice that in this schematic, the improvements I'm suggesting for the repair therapies are actually slower than the improvements I'm going to need down here for the retardation therapies. But forget that. The point is they still have to be not an infinitesimal rate of improvement. Otherwise, you might extend the thing further along, but the general long-term trend would still be downwards rather than upwards. So there's a threshold rate at which we need to improve the comprehensiveness of these therapies, following the initial breakthrough where we could fix maybe half the damage and we got maybe 30 years of extra life. There's a threshold rate of improvement below which aging still happens and above which it just doesn't. And that's such an important concept that I've given it a name. I call it longevity escape velocity. Here it is, the rate at which rejuvenation therapies need to be improved following the achievement of this threshold of a few decades of extra life that I call robust human rejuvenation, in order to stay one step ahead of the problem. Simple idea, as you've seen on the little schematics earlier. Not a lot of words, but that's life. So the question then is, are we going to do that? I want to say yes, we are. It's actually very clear that we are actually going to manage it. But I'm going to get onto that in a minute. That's number 3 in this list. First thing I'm going to talk about is this one here, because of course this is supposed to be focusing at least partly on economics. What I've established so far is that we're looking at a situation in which combating aging and extending life is going to be done most easily, most practically, in a manner that does not have declining health involved, in which there is no concept of trade-off between the quality and the quantity of life the way there is in today's world. So essentially what I've said is you can't argue that there's any kind of ethical issue around life extension on the basis that there is this trade-off and we need to think terribly hard about how to analyse that trade-off. There won't be such a trade-off. I'm going to give the same sort of answer to all the other things here. I'm going to go into this one now, economics. Here is a statistic that is quite well known, some of you seen it before. Most of a typical person's medical expenses in the Western world are incurred in the last year of their life. That's irrespective of how long they live, of how old they are when they die. If you're 60, if you're 70, if you're 90, if you're 110, this is still usually true. That tells you how incredibly expensive it is to let people get in that condition in the first place. These therapies will not let people get in that condition in the first place. The causes of death that will occur will be causes that do not relate to how long ago you were born, and as we all know, pretty much all of those causes tend to be sudden, and therefore the expense involved is very much less than the expense involved in the treating of people who are going downhill slowly, which is typical of the situation with aging. Now, of course there are exceptions, but we don't worry about exceptions right now because we're talking about averages, because we're talking about economics, we're talking about population. That's just the start. That's just the direct costs. Think about the indirect costs. I bet some of you have parents who are not in the condition they used to be, or at least grandparents who are not in the condition they used to be. And, when people's parents get into that condition, often it means that they can't work so much. They can't contribute so much to society because they're spending too much of their time and effort, and money for that matter, caring for their parents. And it's not just parents, of course, loved ones in general. Right? So that's another massive factor that has to be taken into account. Lack of wealth contribution, in other words, people who are sick are not actually contributing wealth to society, they're just consuming wealth. And finally, of course, variety of expertise. People have a wide variety of experience in their lives. People who've lived longer have different experiences that people who haven't lived very long just don't have. And it's not even a human phenomenon, it's true even in other species that there's a tendency to try to protect the oldest individuals in a herd, for example, of elephants, for example, because the knowledge that they have, the expertise that they have in avoiding relatively rare bad situations is valuable enough to justify the effort involved in protecting such an individual from being the one that gets caught by the tigers or whatever. So there's an awful lot of reasons why aging is awfully expensive. I'm not going to talk about that anymore because actually there's plenty of published work on this that you can perfectly well look up. But the conclusions are really amazingly dramatic. Even if we ignore the business of aging being indefinitely postponed, and we just think about the healthy lifespan being extended, followed by a relatively unchanged period of sickness at the end, even then you get enormous numbers. Of course, that I just described is the situation that has happened so far in, let's say, the post-war period, where at least a decade or so has been added to people's life, and most of that addition has been of healthy life. Some people have studied what that's meant for the impact on the gross national product of, I think, actually the main studies been done in the USA. And the answer is it's responsible for most of it. Most of the increase in the wealth of the USA since the war has been a consequence of the fact that people are living longer than they did then. And even though that's only like 10 years longer and you've still got sickness at the end of it. So it's completely extraordinary what the numbers come out as. Now this one. This is a really important one. The speed, how soon we're going to succeed and with what probability. I'm going to talk a bit about why I think that we are so likely to reach, first of all, robust human rejuvenation and then longevity escape velocity, because it's something that we all need to understand. For sure, it doesn't matter how valuable, how economically or indeed in other ways valuable such an eventuality would be if there's absolutely zero chance that we'll actually achieve it. 0 times anything is still 0. So we'd better figure out that there's a respectable chance of success, a sufficient chance of success to justify the logic here. And I'm going to start with a little analogy. I'm going to talk about cars. And the reason I'm going to do that is because cars are obviously machines and the body is also a machine. The human body is a really complicated machine, but it's still a machine, and therefore it makes sense to look at how we already successfully maintain, and how well we do it, the longevity of simple man-made machines, and to analogize from there with regard to our prospects for doing the same thing to this much more complicated machine called the human body. This is a more than 50-year-old Volkswagen Beetle, and of course it didn't get that way because it was built to last 50 years. It got that way because it's been extremely well looked after. If you look after your car only as well as the law requires, then it might last 10 or 15 years before you have to junk it and get a new one. But it turns out that if you do it better than that, then the car lasts forever. And this car will probably be going 100 years from now. Certainly there are cars that are 100 years old, and they're doing as well as they were when they were built. And the only reason there are no cars that are 200 years old is because cars were not invented 200 years ago. So cars, vintage cars literally have a negligible mortality rate. The only time that vintage cars go out of circulation is if their owners die or get sick of them. So this is pretty good news. And more than that, if I go back to actual biology, we're making enormously rapid progress in this area. First thing I want to do is actually go back to my book that I mentioned a few minutes ago. It was published in 2007. And a year later, because it did well, we were asked to update it for a paperback edition. And in order to update it, essentially we're going to have to rewrite an awful lot because so much had happened. Eventually what we had to do was write an entire new chapter, a full-length chapter, an afterword sort of thing, just to cover 1 year of progress. It was really heartening to see and to have it spelled out so clearly how enormously rapid progress was. I've put this up here because it came out just a few months ago, and it's a nice exciting study which, well, I won't go into detail because, as I don't know, most of you are not biologists, but essentially this was the first really clear demonstration of, first of all, the validity of one of the 7 strands of the sense strategy, and second, of the plausibility of actually fixing it. These mice were engineered in such a way that it was particularly easy to implement this particular rejuvenation therapy, and it worked incredibly well. These mice, this mouse and this mouse are the same age. This mouse has not been treated with this rejuvenation thing. This mouse has, and as you can see, this mouse is much healthier. This is one of a dozen or more graphs in the paper that looks at particular aspects of that health. This is looking at muscle. So it was damn good news. Another thing, and this is now something that, unlike the previous slide, is work that goes on in Sense Foundation, is the elimination of molecular garbage. We care about that a lot, especially the elimination of molecular garbage inside cells, because that turns out to be the main driving force for some of the most important diseases of old age. In particular, it's the thing that drives cardiovascular disease, as well as, for example, macular degeneration. And for the past 13 or 14 years, I've been interested in the possibility that we might be able to eliminate these substances that the body does not naturally eliminate by using enzymes taken from other species, especially enzymes taken from the environment, taken from bacteria. The idea is just graphically in a cartoon shown here. There's a process that turns young people into old people, and eventually into dead people. And then there's another process which turns dead people into decomposed people. But that process, of course, is not encoded in our genome. It's encoded in the genomes of the bacteria and such like that perform it. So what we should do is figure out how they do it, how they break down the stuff that we can't break down. And then once we figure that out, we can apply that and that knowledge, put their genes, for example, into our own cells. This is my horrible cartoon of a neuron. Thereby counteracting the initial process that turned young people into old people in the first place. That's the idea, very simple. It turns out it works. This is just one slide showing you where we are at the moment in that process. We have found a particular enzyme that is quite good at breaking down a particular nasty substance that is actually very important in cardiovascular disease. And we have succeeded in putting it into mammalian cells, not into humans yet or even mice, but just cells in culture, but still, that's a great start. And it works. Essentially what these graphs are showing, these histograms, is that so long as you don't have a ridiculous amount of this toxic substance, 7-ketocholesterol, if you have a ridiculous amount, then the enzyme just doesn't cope, it's just like overwhelmed. But if you have a modest amount, then cells that have this enzyme targeted to the correct part of the cell and so on, do better. The cell's more viable than if they don't have it. These other little bars are negative controls where, for example, the cells don't have the gene, or they have the gene but it's not targeted to the right place in the cell, things like that. So this is really quite good news. It's preliminary data. We haven't yet got this working well enough, but we'll be publishing it quite soon. We have published work on earlier stages of this project, looking at things like just demonstration that the enzyme really works on the substrate, in vitro, things like that. So it's pretty good news. So what I've said so far is I've summarized some of the reasons for thinking that we've got a good chance of getting to robust human rejuvenation fairly soon. In other words, justifying my somewhat controversial contention that we could achieve that within the next, let's say, 25 years with, let's say, 50% probability. I think that if that's true, if we really do get there in that sort of amount of time, then we've again got an extremely strong argument that says that we really need to get on and do this as fast as we can. But I'm going to make it even stronger, because now I'm going to talk about whether we're going to get to longevity escape velocity. So I explained that in the scenario that I summarized schematically earlier on, basically we should be able to get to longevity escape velocity pretty quickly after we get to robust human rejuvenation, but I didn't really give you any concrete reasons for saying that. So I'm going to try now. A few years ago, I did, with a colleague, a computer simulation of the aging process. I took the definition of aging that I've been using for this whole talk, and we did a computer simulation so that we could superimpose onto normal aging the impact of interventions of the sort I've described. Interventions that are initially imperfect and are progressively improved. And it's all published, so obviously I can provide reprints and so on if you want, but that means that I'm just going to summarize the bottom line, and here it is. So these are survival curves. The survival curve is simply a graph showing what proportion of an initial population is still alive after some given amount of time. So the black line here, this one right on the left, is not a simulation, that's actual data for how long people live. I think it was US males in 1999, something like that. And of course it's pretty obvious, everyone by definition is alive at age 0, and not much happens for a long time until age 50 or 60, and then people start dropping like flies and hardly anyone gets past 100. So that's all straightforward. Now, look at the dark blue line. The dark blue line is a simulation from this program, and here what's happening is that everyone has the same intrinsic risk of death at any given age that is present in the case of the black line, but in this case they're getting these therapies. However, they're only getting them starting at the age of 80. The presumption is that the first generation of these therapies comes along when these people are 80. So that's why the two lines are coincident until here, because of course half the people are dead by the age of 80. After that, you've got some benefit, but very little benefit. So first of all, I want to emphasize that that's exactly what you would expect, because these people are already not very well. And like I said earlier, being frail is risky, and it always will be. These things are going to help people live longer when they're healthy, not live longer when they're unhealthy. So what's happening here is basically the therapies are benefiting these people, but they're not really pulling them out of the fire fast enough because they're not good enough yet. So the people retain a high risk of death each year, and just statistically nobody gets out the back. But now let's look at this line, this grey line. This line here is exactly the same simulation as for the dark blue line, except for one thing. The therapies are introduced 10 years earlier, at the age of 70. So as you can see, it's the same deal at first, not a lot of benefit, but now the difference is that for some lucky people who get over 100, 120 or so, the therapies do start to get the upper hand. The therapies have been progressively improved in the simulation, and eventually the people who are lucky enough to get out to 150 or more have a very low risk of death from any cause relating to aging. These graphs do not represent any aspects of death independent of aging. And as you can see, 10% of these individuals reach unambiguous longevity escape velocity with a as good as 0 chance of dying from anything related to aging. If you're 60 when the therapies start, then nearly half of you get out the back. So this is completely unequivocally longevity escape velocity. But, broken record, it's even better than that. Look up here. In this simulation I was just ludicrously, insanely over-pessimistic in the assumptions that were built in, the parameters that were built in. What I said was, we're going to assume that these therapies only double in their efficacy, that's to say, we halve the proportion of damage that still can't be fixed, every 42 years. 42 years. Now, I want you to think about just how crazily pessimistic that is. 42 years is the amount of time that it took from when Lindbergh flew solo across the Atlantic for the first time to when Concorde flew across the Atlantic for the first time. That is how much progress we made last century in 42 years in another technology. The idea that in this century, when obviously things are moving faster anyway, we would make only that much progress, only a factor of 2, it's completely insane. But it's still enough, is the point, right? It still gives us longevity escape velocity without the faintest question. So it doesn't matter how counterintuitive you may think that concept is. Fact is, when we get to robust human rejuvenation, these few decades of additional life, in fact, quite possibly before we get even that much, we will be at longevity escape velocity. And the possibility that we would ever fall below longevity escape velocity again is basically vanishing. It's just vanishingly unlikely. All right. So, first of all, what does this mean for longevity? This is the sort of thing that I tend to have to say at such points, because obviously everyone cares about longevity an awful lot. We don't know how soon we're going to get to robust human rejuvenation. I've said that we have a 50% chance of getting there within the next 25 years or so, but that's just speculation, because for any technology where it's more than a few years away, it's speculation how long it's going to be. I would certainly accept that there's at least a 10% chance that we won't get there for 100 years. I don't care about that, of course, because a 50% chance is abundantly enough to be worth fighting for. But still, we've got to accept that we do not know how long it's going to take. And we're going to need to get that far in order to get anyone out to the age of 150, because, as I say, it's a few decades of additional life that we're looking at, and the world record longevity lifespan now is 122. Wonderful lady named Jeanne Calment, who died in 1997 in the south of France. But what we can say is that when we do get to this point, we will have done the hard part. We will be at and above longevity escape velocity, and therefore the first person to live to 1,000 is almost certainly not much younger than the first person to live to 150. That's the key point. 1,000 is not taken out of the air, by the way. 1,000 is roughly the age that most of us would live to if aging didn't exist. In other words, if you just do the arithmetic and you say how often do people die in young adulthood when aging is not an issue, in the West of course, if you reach the age of 26, what is your chance of not reaching the age of 27? It's pretty low, it's less than 1 in 1,000. So clearly that means that the half-life of a population that didn't have aging would be in 4 digits. So, and of course that's very, very pessimistic as well. It's also ludicrous because chances are we're going to work a little bit to actually reduce our risk of death from other causes as well over the next little while. So, these numbers are not crazy, however counterintuitive they may sound. So again, we can eliminate the argument that we need to actually, wring our hands and cogitate a great deal about the question of doing all of this on the basis that the chance of success and the amount of success in a foreseeable period of time is too low to justify this. The fact is, the chance of success in a very foreseeable time frame is pretty high, and the amount of success that we're talking about is indefinite. So that argument also goes away. Now, continuity of identity. This is something where I can actually talk proper ethics a little bit, because it has come up a bit. But it's not really ethics, it's more metaphysics, to be honest. First of all, let me talk about uploading. I know that a month or so ago you had Anders Sandberg talk to this group, and he didn't talk about that, as I recall. He talked about the value of enhancements and so on. But a lot of Anders' work is about the possibility and the methods by which we might transfer our personality and our memories and so on from this rather squishy, wet substrate to something more durable. And of course that actually plays very strongly in the pro-longevity world, because more durable stuff lasts longer by definition. So some people would quite like to do that. Personally, I rather enjoy being made out of meat, but you get the idea. But there is a big problem with uploading, as it's called, which is that it's not clear really whether you would still be the same person. People get terribly worried about things like the fact that you could upload the same person twice, for example. There are various proposed methods for doing this which do not involve such dilemmas, things like incremental replacement of neurons at a sufficiently slow rate by non-biological ones. But these are reasonable questions. But of course these questions do not apply if all we're doing is biomedical, if all we're doing is maintaining the body in its current form, made of more or less the same stuff, and doing just medicine. The differences that occur, especially in the brain, as a result of any of the therapies that we would be contemplating in this scenario, are much less than the differences that occur naturally in the brain during the life that we know today. So if you're unwilling to accept that you are a different person now than you were 10 years ago or 20 years ago, then you should be very unwilling to contemplate the idea that you would be a different person 1,000 years from now as a result of these therapies than you are today. There's a little bit more to the continuity of identity thing though, because some people have said, well, okay, maybe the structure of the brain won't be changing, and so from a purely physical materialist point of view, you'll be the same person forever, however long you live. But that's not really what personhood is about. Personhood is about the mind, not the brain. And the mind keeps changing, you get new memories, new experiences, you become a different person. But John Harris, among other people, has pointed out that, again, you can use a sort of subdivision argument. You can say, well, okay, look, was I the same person yesterday? If you are unwilling to embrace the idea that you were a different person yesterday than you are today, different in a personhood sense, of course, I'm talking now, then you must also, by induction, be unwilling to accept that you were a different person 2 days ago, and 3 days ago, and similarly out into the future. So this again really sort of goes away. It just cannot be sustained as an argument for doubting the ethical value of extending healthy life. The last one I'm going to talk about, this one here, is more of a sociological one, but it leads into an ethical one. And I think really this is the strongest ethical point I want to make. Some people say, oh dear, life would be terrible if we stopped dying and people carried on living. And they'll have various ways of justifying this emotion. Probably, in fact, certainly by some distance, the most common is that they're worried about there being too many people. That if you've got, hardly any deaths because you've got no aging, then the world's going to fill up and it's going to be awful because people are already very concerned about the fact that we may have too many people already for the carrying capacity of the planet. And, I have some sympathy with this emotion, but only some. The first thing I like to say when confronted with this question, or indeed with any of the other sociological questions that come up, is I try to give specific, sincere answers, talking about why I think such a problem is probably not going to arise, or how we would deal with it if it did arise. And in this case, what I tend to say is, well, first of all, look at fertility rates. Whenever any society reaches a level of female education and emancipation, a certain level, then without any exception in the history of civilization, fertility rates have come down very fast. And that's still happening. In particular, it's now happening very fast in all of the most populous countries of the world, China, India, Brazil, and so on. So that's why the United Nations currently predicts that global population will start to decline mid-century. Now, of course, if we did indeed eliminate death from aging, then the problem would come back somewhat, but we don't know how far it would come back. And one other thing that people have certainly not looked at is the possibility that one of the things we'll fix in aging, and I would say this is not just a possibility, it's a certainty, one of the things we'll fix is menopause, so that women will be able to have kids at any age they like. Now the first reaction that you might have to that is, well, oh dear, that sounds like the overpopulation will be even worse than otherwise. But actually that's completely wrong, because another thing that's universally observed in societies that become more and more affluent and educate their women better is that not only does the total number of children that women have go down, but also the average age at which they have them goes up. Which makes sense, bringing up children is a pretty time-consuming business. There are plenty of things that women want to do, and if they've got the opportunity to do them before that, then they go and do them on average. But now, supposing you suddenly don't have this biological clock anymore, you don't have this deadline, you've got the option to delay your first child by another decade and another decade. It seems pretty much inescapable that that's what's going to happen in the case of a lot of women, which of course has an enormous effect on the trajectory of global population, irrespective of the overall number of children that your average woman has in their whole life. So that's pretty good news. But the biggest thing I want to say about a question like overpopulation is about our ignorance of the future. The single thing that's going to make the most difference, I suspect, to whether there's an overpopulation problem as a result of defeating aging is other technologies. Let's just take the example of nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion obviously has been a while coming, but it would be a brave man who put bets on it's not being developed in the next century, let's say in the next 50 years. Supposing it is, obviously that's going to have a massive effect on our use of fossil fuels. And if you think about it, there's nothing wrong with having 7 billion people on the planet. The problem is having 7 billion people, each of whom has a significant ecological footprint. So, suddenly it becomes fine to have a growth in world population. This is just one example, for illustration, of the sort of thing we don't know about the future. So this is where I come to transitioning from sociology to ethics in this topic. The fact that we don't know what the future is going to be like, what other technologies are going to be developed, is all we need to look at in realizing that we have a moral obligation to develop these therapies as soon as possible. Because, you've probably all heard of the precautionary principle, the idea that it would be a bad idea to develop technology that might be bad for us. Well, the precautionary principle works both ways. Here's the precaution I want to take. I want to make sure that 50 years from now, my descendants are not looking back at me and my generation and saying, well, you fucked up, didn't you? You didn't tell us you didn't work out how to let us escape aging because you thought the world would be different than how it actually is, and therefore you have condemned us to an unnecessarily early and unnecessarily painful death because you thought you were clever and you could work out what the world was going to be like. That's the precaution I want to take. I want to make sure that humanity of the future has the choice whether to use these technologies and how to use them, and they're not going to have that choice unless we develop them as soon as possible. It's as simple as that for me. So that's what it's all about. And I'm just going, for the last few minutes of my remarks, to talk a little bit about how we might address this when talking to other people. I don't know how critical of my comments you guys are going to be, but I do know that those of you who are on side with what I have to say will go out and extensively talk to people who are not. And I want to talk a little bit about my experience of doing that, and perhaps give you a few hints about how to go about it. A lot of people fixate on the longevity aspect. You'll talk about combating aging, and they'll immediately think, oh, people are not going to die, and they'll think of all the problems I just alluded to. And they'll immediately turn their brains off at that point and forget the fact that, hello, we have a problem today. The people get sick, and that we're not terribly keen on that. So ultimately I find that the number one rule is to repeat at roughly 5-second intervals that it's all about health. And that any longevity benefit that we may get is a side benefit of staying healthy. The only thing that we're talking about here is that it's really about your health. In other words, that we're talking about foreseeable therapies that can really allow you to look, feel and function just as well as in your early adulthood, however long ago you were born. That is the big difference. What one has to point out to people is that their position essentially comes down to being terribly, terribly in favour of medicine just so long as it doesn't work very well, which, people are reasonably willing to at least stand back and think about. So what's the deal? Why does this happen? Why do people have these knee-jerk reactions? Why do they say things that they would not say to a child to shut them up in any other topic? Ultimately, it's about this. They don't believe that it's going to happen. They believe that aging is inevitable. They know damn well that it's ghastly. So the only rational approach is to put it out of their minds and to get on with their miserably short lives and make the best of it, rather than being preoccupied by all of this business. It's perfectly rational to do that, so long as aging really is inevitable. Makes perfect sense. But of course, as I've told you, aging is no longer inevitable. We are within striking distance of seriously bringing it under the same degree of medical control that we are familiar with for most infectious diseases. So that's fundamentally the problem. So when you get these things, first of all, very often I will give a talk like this, and the first question will demonstrate that the person actually was asleep for my entire lecture, because they'll just not realise that I'm talking about extending healthy life. So again, you've got to repeat health, health, health. Then people say, well, I wouldn't. How long? Someone actually asked me, and it was video. It's quite a good video clip. I like to show it. I ought to show it. But someone says, and this happens all the time. They say, well, how long do you want to live then? What's so good about living a long time? So my answer is, okay, I've got a question for you. What time do you want to go to the toilet next Sunday? And people go nonplussed for a while, and then I say, no, that's a stupid question. But the thing is, you know why it's a stupid question. You know it's a stupid question because you know that you're going to have better information on the topic nearer the time, right? So it's completely ridiculous to have an opinion about that question. It's exactly the same. I haven't the faintest clue whether I want to live to 100, but I do know that I want to be able to make the choice whether to live to 100 when I'm 99, rather than having that choice progressively removed from me by my declining health. So it's completely nonsensical to have an opinion about how long you want to live. Yes, I've gone through all sociological questions already, so you get them all the time, and actually my view is that even though it's it pains me a lot. Nevertheless, it is valuable to have good, specific answers to these questions and actually discuss the scenario as if they were serious. But equally, I think it's important to stand back and give the blanket answer that I've given, that it's all about choice. It's all about our duty to give humanity the future of choice. This one here, however, I want to highlight, because again it comes down to an ethical question, as well as an economic question actually, and a really important one. People will honestly say this. People will say, well, I'm not really interested, you won't get these therapies and stuff from me, especially the older generation, which I have to talk to a lot because they're the ones with money. People will actually say this in front of their kids. I've seen it happen. Sometimes this is what I do. I actually say, when there's an audience that has this sort of sentiment, I'll say, okay, hands up everyone who's got kids. And I'll put their hands up, most of them, and then I'll say, put your hands down. Okay, now, everyone put your hands up if you've got kids, but you don't give a flying fuck about their welfare. It sort of gets it through to them, but it's really painful. And you would never see this in any other topic. It's generally fashionable to be moderately altruistic, so I'm told. Right. But of course the deal here is they feel they can say this, they feel they can think this because they really genuinely feel that aging is just part of life. It's like, the speed of light. It's not something that can be fixed. So just a reminder, it's all about health. This is the book I mentioned, it's called Ending Aging. Do get hold of it if you fancy understanding a bit about the detailed biology of all of this. It's written for the non-specialist, by which I mean you don't need to have done biology since O level in order to understand. Sorry, you don't have O levels anymore. GCSE, whatever. In order to understand it, but it's very dense. In other words, it doesn't cut any corners at all. Biologists who do read it will certainly not feel shortchanged. So yeah, you might have to take it a bit slowly, but it's pretty up to date still, even though it's a few years old. So I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to spend a little while chatting.
We'll take questions for 5 minutes, and then we're going to go for dinner after. Everyone's welcome, unless there's loads and loads of people.
So this is a relatively layman question, I'm afraid, but
sure.
I was really interested in a lot of it, specifically the demonstration of the rat study you showed, or the mouse study with 7 ketone cholesterol.
Okay, so let's go. Yeah, go on.
And I wondered, sort of wildly speculating, I might think that bacteria would benefit from having very general purpose sort of metabolist.
Yeah. Okay. So this is quite this is actually quite a curious thing. Bacteria obviously are very versatile in what they can break down, but they've got only so many genes, so they can't break down everything. Some bacteria can grow faster than others on particular substrates. But about 50 years ago, people realised, well, one person realised, actually a professor in Cambridge named Gale, that that wasn't quite enough of an explanation for what was observed. What you see in any environment that you look at in the world is that there'll be a wide variety of microbial life. Now, that's not what you'd expect in general, because you'd expect that for a given environment with a given spectrum of nutrients, some bacteria are just going to grow faster than others, and the fastest ones are going to win. So you're not going to have much variety. Don't see that. And Ed realised that the reason it might be because different bacteria do actually eat different things. And so some slow-growing bacteria might be able to eat things that the fast ones can't, and so that they can carve out an ecological niche anyway. And he was interested in this because he was interested in environmental decontamination, in actually getting rid of pollutants. He was thinking, well, actually a lot of pollutants are recalcitrant compounds. They're intrinsically thermodynamically hard to break down, but not ridiculously hard, and they're organic, and they're energy rich. So if you can break them down, you can live off them. So he said, well, let's look at these bacteria, and if we can find them, maybe we can just grow them up in the lab, put lots of them back into the environment in question, and maybe our pollution will go away. And it took maybe 20 years for anyone to take that idea seriously, but when it was properly tested in the 70s, it was found to be spectacularly true. So a whole field has grown up around this. It's called bioremediation, and it's not just an academic discipline by any means. It's a very thriving commercial business. It really works on pretty much anything: plastics, rubber, dioxins, you name it, TNT. And actually, I got the idea for this because I happened to be working with an office next door to someone who worked in bioremediation. I thought, all right, maybe it'll work on the stuff in the human body as well. Of course, in the human body, we would not want to inject bacteria into the body to get them to do this stuff because they'd probably eat other stuff that we'd rather they didn't. But if we find the specific genes that they're using to eat the stuff that we care about, then we might have a chance, and that's what this is about. Go ahead.
How much money roughly is annually being spent on anti-aging research, and to follow up all the big leads, like how much would you want?
Well, our annual budget in Sense Foundation at the moment is about $4 or $5 million. The work that's being done independently of Sense Foundation that's relevant to the development of these therapies adds up to probably another, I'm going to say, $20 or $30 million. But most of that, in fact almost all of it, is focused on one or two narrow areas. In particular, nearly all of it is in stem cell research. Stem cell research is very important, no question. And lots of different areas of stem cell research need to be developed in order for this whole plan to work. But it's too focused. What we need, I think that actually if we had that sort of amount, let's say up to $50 million, spread appropriately over all the other more neglected areas, we'd have enough for the next while. The reason it's so little is because basically all the work that needs to be done right now is in cell culture and in mice. We don't have to go to clinical trials yet. Once we've got to a point where pretty much everything in this list is working well in mice, then we should be able to demonstrate pretty radical life extension of mice that have not had nothing done to them at all until they're already in middle age. And once we get that, game over. Everyone's going to forget about all this bollocks, and we're going to be home free. And money won't be a problem. But right now, money is an enormous problem.
So as a student who didn't do biology or anything useful like that, how can we help?
Right, well, any billionaires in the audience, please. No, but seriously, I mean, obviously money is very important here, but it's not the only thing by any means. Ultimately, the really important thing is changing public opinion. Because money can come from wealthy individuals, but it can also come from government, and it can also come from the private sector. And in particular, in the case of government, obviously public policy follows public opinion. So that's why I do such a brutal amount of media, and why I give so many talks, actually. I just get the word out. So of course, if you're a journalist, or if you're a conference organizer, or whatever, then that tells you one thing you can do. Really, everyone can do advocacy. It's all, every little helps. If it's just talking to your friends, talking to your family, talking to your colleagues, talking to your elected representatives, it's all about just getting the word out and informing people, getting them to stop basking in their ignorance of why this is feasible and why it's desirable. Someone over there had a question. Maybe not. You had a question?
Well, I was following on from Matt's question.
Right.
It was, we've already got bacteria in our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
How come that ecological niche is not going to explore where bacteria breaking down waste products in vivo, not ex vivo?
The answer is because we don't have bacteria topologically inside our bodies. We only have them in the gut and the skin. Really, we don't have bacteria. Well, we have some pathogenic bacteria that get inside cells, but only a very small proportion. And they've got better sources of fuel than that, so that they're not competing in the same way that the competition occurs in the environment. Okay.
It's probably quite hard to predict, but roughly what do you see treatments costing?
Yeah, excellent question. So as with any technology, the cost is going to be much higher at first, and it's going to go down. I see these things being pretty expensive, to be honest. I think that ultimately what we're looking at here is a very multifaceted therapy, lots of things being done to the same people at the same time. However, I can't come up with numbers that make the economic argument go away. Essentially, the amount that will be saved is just so astronomical that it's perfectly clear that it would be economically suicidal for any country not to make this whole thing available to everyone who's old enough to need it, irrespective of ability to pay. It'll pay for itself just incredibly quickly. So this is even true in tax-averse countries like the USA. The analogy I like to use is actually basic education. So today's high-tech medicine, obviously that's not the case because the economic argument doesn't work. You end up postponing some disease of old age by a little bit, and then the person gets sick anyway, and you still spend the money you were going to spend otherwise. When that's not true, everything changes. Basic education is just the same in the sense that if you don't educate your kids, then you're going to be economically crippled 20 years down the road as a nation. So even in the USA, basic education is free.
Again, as a non-biologist, this might sound like a stupid question, but what's the role of nanotechnology in this? Is there any?
So nanotechnology means different things to different people. So I want to first of all make clear that the original use of the term nanotechnology, which basically means molecular manufacturing, is the sense in which your question is interesting. Nanotechnology doesn't use today to mean essentially nanomaterials, which are not really necessarily particularly useful biomedically, or at least not in a versatile way. So a number of people have been interested in the possibility of using molecular manufacturing, atomically precise machines medically, and indeed a lot of the arguments for the feasibility of molecular manufacturing are based on the existence of enzymes. The fact that enzymes are fundamentally molecular machines that of course do exist and were built by evolution. So I think certainly there's a very strong case that in the fullness of time we will see extensive medical applications of molecular manufacturing. However, I'm also pretty sure that it's going to be, the fullness of time is going to be fuller than it will be for the biomedical approaches that I've been summarising here. I think I think first it's important to understand that I might be wrong about that, and therefore I'm delighted that there are people pursuing molecular manufacturing in its very first principles stage that it's at the moment, and also of course doing the process of designing the machines that might be useful as and when molecular manufacturing becomes more tractable. I think it's definitely for something for chapters 3 or 4 of this process rather than chapter 1.
Last question.
Go ahead.
So I don't know if you're familiar with Nicholas Ademar's book Humanity's End, where he has a chapter kind of on you and then a chapter.
He sent me the chapter on me.
Yeah. And he has a chapter kind of against natural senescence, saying that we wouldn't want to live in a period of time because even if we remove the threat of death by aging, the threat from kind of non-natural causes, particularly accidents, is going to pervade our lives with a sense of fear. Especially because his argument, I think, is if the prospect of living for 1,000 years is in play, then the potential costs of any accident become that much larger. If I get hit by a bus tomorrow, I'll lose maybe 50, 60 years of life.
Right, I get you.
Imagining I'll lose.
Yeah, it's not a stupid argument at all, and in fact it's an argument that I used to subscribe to somewhat. When I first started thinking about all this, I actually I predicted that when we get these technologies, driving will be outlawed because it's too dangerous. But more recently I came to realise that that's actually oversimplistic, and that the reason it's oversimplistic is fundamentally because we have the ability to use technology to reduce our risk of death from other causes as well. Now, the argument then gets rather complicated because if we're reducing our risk of death from all causes, then it reciprocally increases the likely loss of life when we actually do get hit by a truck or whatever. So in a sense, the risk argument doesn't go away. But ultimately, my most straightforward answer to Agar's idea and to the idea you've just put forward is to stand back and think, okay, subjectively, what would I want? And to be perfectly honest, the problem of having a risk of being hit by a truck sometime in the next millennium is a problem I'd like to have. All right.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you.